Hello and welcome back to part two of the Ottoman Empire. Pictured here is the Ottoman Empire at the very end, uh, where it shrunk considerably, uh, but we'll be picking up where we left off at its height. So we last left off discussing how widespread slavery was in the Ottoman Empire. The Sultan's concubines, much of the military, the household servants, and even the higher officials were all often enslaved people. Um, so this meant that the Sultan was surrounded by slaves, was being served, advised, protected by people that were not necessarily doing so of their own free will. Um, we saw that, sometimes it could be a way of a kind of advancement, right? So you could move up socially by being enslaved, sort of paradoxically. But nonetheless, uh, it's not an ideal situation for anyone by any stretch, and so it could be dangerous to be literally dependent and surrounded by people that were your slaves, and in fact was on occasion, right? The Sultan's personal guard were all janissaries. Janissaries is the name for the military, um, and they could easily turn on him and murder him. And sometimes sultans were murdered by their personal guards. Osman II was murdered by his janissaries after they became sort of like disgruntled with a sort of collection of different policies. His punishments were fairly harsh, and there were other policies that they were unhappy with, and so they simply uh, there are specific difficulties that come with running an empire that has become huge. So the Ottoman Empire at its peak was gigantic, right? On par with the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire. Uh, it takes a lot of money to keep this whole operation running. You're employing lots of officials, a huge military, vast territory. So that means you need tax dollars. Um, and that means that when you need more money, you're sort of leaning on your intermediaries and their various parts of the empire to extract wealth from the population. Um, and as we've seen, in previous empires, right, these intermediaries are a bit of a soft spot, right? There's always a danger of them pushing them too hard, making them feel like maybe they'd rather go off on their own and break off. So the way the Ottomans dealt with this problem of intermediaries was to make all land in the empire officially the possession of the Sultan. The Sultan owned everything, all the territory, and he could grant land, right, sort of temporarily, to an intermediary and say, okay, this is your territory. You can go collect taxes here. Maybe you've got a personal plot and you can farm it or do whatever you like with it. Uh, but that grant could always be revoked, right? So the idea was to make these intermediaries entirely dependent on the Sultan for their income, with the hopes that that would tie them more closely and use them of the notion that maybe they could go it on their own. The Sultan was also the source of all political offices. So if you had a kind of a sweet job, the Sultan could take it away anytime, right? Grant that job to someone else. And so again, your income, your position entirely dependent on the Sultan. That was one strategy, right? But the Ottomans did have to employ multiple strategies. The farther away you get from the center of the empire, the farther away you get from the Sultan, the less salient, right, that connection, less strong that connection is with the Sultan, right? Even if he technically owns all the land, you've never seen him, he doesn't get around very much. So the Sultan's authority is going to be a bit weaker on the edges of the empire. So in those types of areas, rather than demand this sort of tight devotion to the Sultan, they would often allow the local tribes to more or less run their own affairs and grant them a decent amount of autonomy. In reality, they probably had little choice in the matter, right? So why not go along with it? So, for example, the Kurdish tribes pretty much ran their own business for the most part, and a serious attempt by the Ottomans to do them or tie them sort of more tightly to the empire. If you had potentially rebellious, right, people in the center of the empire, or even people that just seemed to get so powerful that they might think about challenging uh, the Sultan would move them to other parts of the empire. Again, we've seen this with the Chinese and other empires, right? Breaking up local power centers and moving them to different parts of the empire in order to prevent any sort of like coalescence into a significant rival center of power. Um, but at the end, the incentive structure was set up so that staying loyal to the Sultan was the best and surest way to get rich and stay rich. And uh, for the most part, that incentive structure worked. So we've mentioned that the Ottomans were fairly tolerant of other religions, even though it was a Muslim empire. They allowed Jews, Christians, and other types of non-Muslims to keep their religion, and also importantly to maintain their own legal systems. And we saw a similar thing with the Romans, right? You had Roman law and you had local law, and often, in some different part of the empire, the locals were largely governed by their own laws. And then if there were any Roman citizens, right, that were colonizing, uh, they would be subject to Roman law, and they could largely be kept distinct, although there was always the possibility of, right, cases where the two intersect. So something similar was practiced in the Ottoman Empire. So Jews could have their own legal systems and their own sort of religious laws. Again, law and religion are bound up fairly tightly in many of the empires we've seen, right? So you have these legally largely autonomous communities, but what kept them loyal was that the leaders of the communities uh, were bound to the Sultan by ties. So again, it was largely by incentives. So if you were an important figure in the Jewish community, you were exempted from taxes, other benefits were allowed to you, and that was an incentive to keep your community sort of tied to the Ottoman Empire and to the Sultan. There were also just benefits to converting to Islam. So even though no one was forced to convert to Islam, many people did. It was the religion, right, of the power structure of the upper class. And so there was a certain amount of social mobility that was made possible if you converted to Islam. You could get into the right circles and maybe rise into the upper classes. Uh, Sometimes manumission or freedom from slavery was offered to people if they converted to Islam. So there were, again, largely the idea was set up the incentives such that people are loyal to the Sultan and people are attracted to Islam. But Christians weren't forced to convert, and sometimes that was useful, right? If you needed to govern a distant territory in your empire that was largely Christian, you could send a Christian to govern that territory. And this sort of pluralism is kind of reflected in Bayezid the First, the names of his sons, right? He named his sons Jesus, Moses, Solomon, and Muhammad, right? There was at its peak, there was a good deal of sort of inter-religious harmony. This harmony began to decline when there was a challenge to the Sultan. There was a rebellion by this sort of radical figure who wanted to proclaim sort of total equality between Christians and Muslims instead of this sort of like, you know, de facto superiority of Muslims but large tolerance of Christians. Right? They wanted total equality, and so that rebellion had to be put down. And the experience of that sort of made the establishment a bit more conservative and a bit more uh, Muslim for the latter part of the empire. So there was always war going on. One of the primary opponents was the Shiite empire in Persia, in Iran, the Safavid empire. Um, the Ottoman Sultan Selim I finally defeated the Safavids, their enemies to battle. There were the Mamluks in Egypt. Um, but there was a good deal of military success, right? And eventually the Ottomans uh, ruled a good amount of territory in Egypt, Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, Arabia, um, holy city of Mecca, right, which made the Ottomans sort of the protectors of Islam and the sort of uh, the primary Islamic state. So as I said, different um, religions were often allowed to a large degree to practice their own legal systems, but there was an official legal system of the empire. There were actually two. So there was Sharia law, which is the Islamic law, Islamic religious law. Uh, it, there was not a single interpretation of Sharia law, and there were competing interpretations. The Ottomans adopted a particular Sunni version of the law uh, for local matters, right, and matters to which sort of these religious laws could be applied, but these laws didn't always apply to some of the things that the emperor needed to do. It was not designed for that sort of large scale application. Uh, so another kind of law, Kunan, was defined on the role of the sultan, his relation with his subjects, tax codes, and things like that. So in that law, there was a distinction made between normal citizens who were taxed and then the sultan's servants, and they were governed by a different set of rules. So we notice like a patchwork of distinctions between distinctions, right? You have different religions with their legal systems. We have two main legal systems within the Ottoman Empire, Sharia law and Kunan, and then even within Kunan, there's different legal systems for different categories of people. Uh, so we have very much a, a divided sort of citizenry, and it sort of marks an extreme from the kind of Greco-Roman conception of there are citizens, right, and there are non-citizens, there are slaves. But if you're a citizen, you're more or less equal to other citizens in Greece and in Rome. Um, Not the case in the Ottoman Empire. They're whole an entire sort of like rich sort of levels, um, which perhaps feels a little, lacking some central sense of equality in ours to our minds, which are largely influenced by Greece and Rome. But for the Ottomans, this also allowed for a good deal of flexibility. So if it was helpful, right, to grant special rights to certain groups of Christians in Hungary that were conquered but needed to be subdued and governed, the Sultan could do that, right? The Sultan could modify the law as he felt would. So that's basically the idea. We won't go through sort of the entire decline of the Ottoman Empire. It's quite long. Uh, but remember, we began these last few weeks comparing these contemporaneous empires, right? The Spanish Empire of Charles V and then the Ottoman Empire that were operating at the same time. There's some interesting comparisons that we can make now that we have a general understanding of the nature of each of them. So remember, Charles V was Holy Roman Emperor, right? Which was a sort of like it wasn't continuous with the Roman Empire; it was sort of a reconstituted thing, although it was sanctioned by the Catholic Church, which was continuous all the way from the Roman Empire. So there's a certain link to Rome for Charles V. But then we have Suleiman and the Ottomans governing the exact same territory of the original Roman Empire, right? Taking over, conquering the Byzantines. So both of these empires linked sort of their greatness to the prestige of Rome, and in a sense, they're parallel um, continuations of the Roman Empire, at least in spirit. But they were very different in their economics and their goals and their operations. So the Spanish, um, once they discovered that they could extract wealth from America and that could keep them afloat, recall that Spanish emperor had much less authority than the Ottoman sultans. He had a sort of contractual agreement with the powerful lords in his area, but he did not have absolute authority, and so he couldn't just extract wealth when he needed it from his subjects. Charles V needed to find ways to make a buck, and once they figured out that they could extract wealth from America, that's how they uh, funded and his successors funded that empire. Um, so it was largely a commercial enterprise, the Spanish. The Ottomans were really much a bit of a more old-fashioned empire in one sense. They were expanding, unifying these ancient lands of the Middle East and the Mediterranean, and resurrecting a version of the Roman Empire. Now, the Ottomans did go deep into Europe, right? So they governed this huge, diverse state, right? It included all three of sort of the West's major religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Um, Meanwhile, Charles V started out, right? That empire started out under Ferdinand and Isabella by conquering the Muslim parts of Spain, uh, creating a unified Catholic empire that then, not long after, began to splinter after the Protestant Reformation, and there were constant uh, wars just among the Christians, right? Whereas the Ottomans seem to have been able to largely unify these very disparate religions. Something to be said, I guess, about right. Recall the Ottomans, the only religion that they were at war with was Shiite Muslim, right, versus Sunnis that the Ottomans were. Similar thing, right? The closer you are, the more vicious sometimes the hatred is. So the infighting among Christians and the infighting among Muslims was rather fierce. Where the Ottomans could tolerate using Christians much more easily. And ultimately, Charles V and his successors could never defeat the Ottomans, right? The Ottoman Empire did persist in he did try. So Charles V tried to ally with the Safavids, right, the Iranian Shiite empire, to try to defeat the Ottomans. The Ottomans, in retaliation, Suleiman allied with Charles's enemies, the French and the Germans. And of course, the Ottomans never conquered Spain either, right? They were existed at the same time, were perpetually at odds with each other, but neither completely gained dominance. The Ottomans went as far as Hungary, took over Hungary, but they stopped short of an all-out war with um, you could say the Ottomans had the superior army, in particular land army. Um, the Sultan had the authority to take whatever young people he wanted, right, from the citizenry, put them in, make them slaves, and raise them as like lifelong soldiers. So Charles V had nothing like that power. He pretty much had to buy his military, but he had the money. Right, the Americas were at that time generating a good deal of cash for Charles, and that kept him afloat despite his limited authority. You might argue long run colonial expansion was the better long range strategy, right? So, Spain still exists. Spain was quite powerful, right on into, well, I don't know. Maybe I don't. Maybe that's not. It's hard to say which is the better, more successful strategy. But it seems like the colonial powers, right, like Spain and England, do start to dominate the scene up into maybe World War One. So uh, that's a matter for debate, I guess, right? But at any rate, it was a longer term strategy, this colonial expansion, and the fruits probably wouldn't be seen right away. Obvious that sort of focus on commerce would end up being so successful versus the authoritarian structure of the Ottomans. So Burbank and Cooper, while acknowledging that there's diversity within these empires and that no particular classificatory scheme is going to be completely accurate, right? They say there are sort of two abstract models of empire types, right? There's a class hierarchy model and a patrimonial model. They say we can look at Spain, I think, fruitfully as a class hierarchy model. So you had distinct classes, right? You had peasants, you had lords, you had the king, um, and they all dealt with each other. Uh, there was tension between all those classes, right? And within the classes, there was more unity. Lords would unify against the king and against the peasants. The peasants were, opposed to the lords, but had no ill will themselves. The sort of stratified. You can compare that with the Ottoman Empire, which they call a patrimonial model, which is that there's not so much competing classes with their own sorts of power. There is the Sultan, and the Sultan is all the power, right? All power flows from the Sultan. So he claims direct sort of vertical ties with everyone, with his immediate, officials, with the peasantry. Everyone is loyal to the Sultan, right? And that power relies on his ability to provide benefits to the people that are loyal to him. Again, it was not fear of punishment so much as the promise of rewards if you participated in the system and got in good with the Sultan. So very different models for empire, and we'll see moving forward. We won't have time. Meanwhile, their civilization is continuing in China, right? We've never been able to talk about empires in Africa, which is really unfortunate. And I really want to, as soon as I have time to develop the course, to include some of that as well. So there's a lot we're not going to talk about, but what we are going to focus on moving forward is we're going to move to Europe and talk about Spain and the British empires and these colonial empires and the way they here in the United States. So we'll see you next week.